this. A single woman stabbed in an alleyway in Lower Manhattan. The media shrugged it off as another statistic in a city teeming with unpredictability. But when the second victim, a Wall Street banker, was found strung up in a subway station, his entrails forming a grotesque message, "You're all meat," the city took notice. Detective Lauren Reyes, a fresh transfer to the NYPD homicide unit, was assigned to the case. At 29, she was eager to prove herself, but the grisly nature of the murders tested her resolve. The killer was meticulous: no fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA. Just a calling card, a butcher's cleaver left buried in the victim's chest. Perspective 1, the butcher. By day, he blended into the city's crowd, just another face in a sea of millions. At night, he became something else entirely. The butcher didn't kill for money or revenge, he killed because it made him feel alive. The screams, the smell of blood, the terror in their eyes, it was art. Tonight's target was a young couple walking through Central Park. He followed silently, his heavy cleaver hidden beneath his trench coat. The sound of the woman's laughter annoyed him, it was too pure, too untouched by the darkness of the city. He decided she would die first. Perspective 2, Lauren Reyes. Lauren stood over the body of the latest victim, a cab driver. His throat slashed so deeply his head was nearly severed. "The butcher is escalating," her partner muttered, but Lauren was too focused on the carved message on the cab's windshield, "Cattle must fall." The butcher didn't just want to kill, he wanted to terrify. Lauren spent sleepless nights poring over maps and timelines, searching for a pattern. But his victims were random, no connection, no clear motive. The only consistency was his brutality. Perspective 3, the victim, Marta Vasquez, knew better than to walk home late, but the subway was packed, and the claustrophobia opted for the quiet streets of Harlem instead. The first sign was the sound of footsteps echoing behind her. She quickened her pace, clutching her keys like a weapon. The second sign was the metallic glint of a blade catching the dim streetlight. The butcher didn't run, he never needed to. He liked the chase, the way fear slowed his prey down. Marta screamed as he lunged, but she fought back harder than he expected, slashing his arm with her keys before escaping into a bodega. Lauren's breakthrough came from an unexpected lead. A security camera outside a deli captured a blurry image of a man leaving the scene of a murder. The footage led her to an abandoned meatpacking plant in the meatpacking district. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay. Hooks hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as if recently disturbed. Bloodstains trailed across the floor, leading to a dimly lit room where the butcher waited, his cleaver glinting in the faint light. Lauren faced him alone, her gun drawn but her heart pounding. "Why do you do it?" she demanded, stalling for backup. The butcher tilted his head, his voice muffled behind his mask. "Because this city is rotten, detective. I'm just carving out the fat." The ensuing battle was savage. The butcher's cleaver slashed inches from Lauren's face as she dodged, firing off rounds that barely slowed him. In a desperate move, she kicked over a vat of rancid oil, sending him sprawling, but the butcher wasn't done. He lunged one last time, only to be met with a bullet to the head. He collapsed, his mask slipping off to reveal an unremarkable face, just another nobody lost in the chaos of New York City. Despite the butcher's death, the city's fear didn't fade. Copycat killers emerged, inspired by his infamy. Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over, and in the shadows of another alleyway, someone picked up a cleaver, grinning at their reflection in the "He never sleeps," they whispered. "Neither will I." Lauren Reyes thought it was over. The butcher, the man who had turned New York City into his personal slaughterhouse, lay dead, his body riddled with bullets. The papers declared her a hero, the city breathed a collective sigh of relief, and for a moment, Lauren almost believed it herself. But then came the first copycat killing. The body of a young woman was discovered in a trendy Soho apartment, her torso split open and her intestines draped over a chandelier. The victim's blood had been used to scrawl "Cattle must fall" across the walls, a sick echo of the butcher's signature. Lauren stood frozen in the middle of the crime scene. It wasn't just the brutality that unnerved her, it was the precision. This wasn't the work of an amateur. Whoever had done this knew the details of the butcher's kills, details the NYPD had deliberately withheld from the public. Her partner, Detective Marcus Reed, leaned in close. "Looks like you've got a fan club, Hayes." Lauren forced down the bile rising in her throat. "This isn't a fan. This is someone who knows exactly what they're doing." The city plunged back into terror as the killings escalated. Each victim was more gruesomely mutilated than the last. A taxi driver was found hanging upside down in his cab, his skin flayed from his body. A homeless man was burned alive in an oil drum. His charred remains arranged to spell out "pigs must burn." The media dubbed the killer the Butcher too, but Lauren knew better. This wasn't just a copycat, it was someone who wanted to surpass the original. The killer sent a package to Lauren's desk at the precinct, a severed hand clutching a note. The handwriting was eerily similar to the Butcher's. "Miss me? You should. I'm better this time." Lauren's hands trembled as she read the note. She couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that someone had either worked alongside the Butcher, or was continuing his twisted.
Survived, a miracle that came at a horrific cost. Marcus and Lauren found her in the basement of an abandoned warehouse in Queens, her body a tapestry of torture. Both her hands had been nailed to a wooden beam above her head. Her legs were severed below the knees, her stumps crudely cauterized with a blowtorch. Despite her injuries, the woman, Sarah Connolly, was alive and lucid. She whispered through cracked lips, her voice trembling, "He's not human. Not human." "Who?" Lauren pressed, trying to keep Sarah conscious. "He wears the Butcher's mask." "But it's not him. It's worse. It's so much worse." Lauren's blood ran cold. The killer began taunting Lauren directly. Phone calls at 3 a.m., distorted voices whispering her name. Packages containing bloodied scraps of clothing from missing persons. He left a bloodied cleaver outside her apartment with another note, "Run. I like it better that way." Lauren refused to back down. She pored over every piece of evidence, every detail of the Butcher's original killings. What she uncovered sent chills down her spine. There had been a second suspect, a silent partner who had been spotted on security footage near one of the earlier crime scenes but never identified. Lauren tracked down a lead to an underground fight club in Brooklyn, a haven for society's most violent outcasts. The club's owner, a hulking man with a scar running down his face, laughed when Lauren showed him the Butcher's photo. "Yeah, I knew him. He wasn't alone. Guy had a protege. Quiet kid, but man, when he got going, he was something else." "Who is he?" Lauren demanded. The man shrugged. "Never got his name. Just called him Junior." Lauren's stomach churned. If Junior had picked up where the Butcher left off, the city was facing a predator even more dangerous. Lauren and Marcus devised a plan to lure the killer out. They planted false evidence in the media, suggesting the NYPD had found a hidden stash of the Butcher's. The killer struck that night at the precinct itself. Lauren found herself face to face with Junior, a man in his late 20s, wearing the Butcher's original mask. His cleaver gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights. "Do you feel it, detective?" Junior said, his voice calm and unhurried. "That beautiful moment between terror and death? That's where I live. That's where I thrive." Junior lunged. The fight was brutal. Lauren took a slash to the arm but managed to fire off a shot, grazing Junior's shoulder. He fled into the night, leaving behind a trail of blood and a chilling promise: "This city will never be yours again." The climax unfolded in a derelict slaughterhouse on the outskirts of the city, a fitting stage for the nightmare's end. Lauren and Marcus stormed the building, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air reeked of decay, and the walls were lined with the remains of Junior's victims. Hooks swayed from the ceiling, dripping with fresh blood. Junior emerged from the shadows, his mask replaced by his own face, calm, almost serene. "I'm just what this city deserves," he said, raising his cleaver. The ensuing fight was chaos. Marcus was gravely injured, but Lauren pressed on, finally pinning Junior to the ground and driving her knife into his chest. As Junior gasped his final breath, he smiled. "You think this ends with me?" His laughter echoed through the slaughterhouse long after he was gone. The city tried to move on, but whispers of Junior's cult began to surface, others who shared his philosophy, waiting in the shadows to pick up where he left off. Lauren sat alone in her apartment, staring at the blood-streaked mask Junior had worn. She knew the nightmare wasn't over. The city was quieter now, but it wasn't peace, it was fear. New York streets, once vibrant and alive, were subdued, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Lauren Reyes sat in her car, parked outside so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't shake Junior's final words, his sick, gleeful laugh as he promised it wasn't over. She hadn't slept in days. The scent of blood seemed to linger everywhere she went, and the phantom sound of Junior's voice haunted her thoughts. Marcus was still in the hospital, fighting for his life after their last encounter with Junior. She hadn't visited him yet. She couldn't bring herself to see the wreckage left in her partner's body, not while she still carried the weight of the city's terror on her shoulders. The first sign that Junior's legacy was alive came 2 weeks later. A middle-aged man was found chained to a radiator in an abandoned tenement building. His limbs had been removed with surgical precision, and his torso bore a single word carved deep into his flesh: disciple. His tongue had been cut out, but he was still alive, barely clinging to consciousness when the police arrived. The sight of his body, grotesque and mutilated, was almost too much for Lauren to bear. The man died in the ambulance before he could identify who had done this to him, but the message was clear: Junior had followers, and they were ready to unleash their own brand of terror. Lauren buried herself in the case, combing through old files, trying to find connections she might have missed. The butcher's legacy was more far-reaching than anyone had imagined. And now it had metastasized into something far worse. Junior's disciples began to surface across the city, leaving bodies behind like breadcrumbs leading to a larger, more sinister design. One night, Lauren returned to her apartment to find her front door ajar. Her pulse quickened as she drew her weapon and stepped inside. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. She moved cautiously, her training battling with the raw fear gnawing. In the center of her living room stood a mannequin, dressed in a blood-stained NYPD uniform. Its face was covered by a crude replica of Junior's mask, and in its plastic hand, it held a butcher's cleaver. Blood dripped from the cleaver onto the floor, pooling at its base. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as she saw the words scrawled across her wall in crimson: "Join us or die." Before she could react, her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number lit up the screen. The message was a video. She hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The video showed a man tied to a chair, his face battered and swollen. His muffled screams filled the room as a figure wearing Junior's mask loomed over him with a blowtorch. The voice in the video was distorted, but Lauren recognized the cadence. It was one of Junior's disciples, speaking directly to her. "Every choice has consequences, Detective Reyes. Save him, or let him burn. But hurry, the clock is ticking." The video cut to an image of a clock on the wall, the hands moving unnaturally fast. She recognized the room immediately. It was an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx, a place she'd passed during one of her earlier investigations. Lauren didn't wait for backup. She knew this was a trap, but she couldn't stand by while another innocent person was tortured. She raced through the city, her sirens cutting through the silence of the night. The warehouse was pitch black when she arrived, save for the faint flicker of firelight coming from deep within. She moved cautiously, her gun drawn, her senses on high alert. The faint smell of gasoline hit her nose just as she heard the muffled cries. She found the man strapped to a chair in the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of lit candles. His clothes were soaked in gasoline, and a trail of fire snaked its way toward him, inching closer with every turn. Shot out the candles and stamped out the fire just in time, freeing the man from his bindings. But before she could lead him out, a door slammed shut behind her, and a voice echoed through the room: "Welcome to the family, detective." The lights flickered on, revealing a group of masked figures standing in the shadows. They held weapons, cleavers, knives, even chainsaws, gleaming in the dim light. Lauren raised her gun, but she was outnumbered. They descended on her like a pack of wolves, their laughter echoing through the warehouse as they dragged her to the ground. The man she had saved was pulled away, screaming as they began carving into him, their blades moving with practiced cruelty. Blood sprayed across the walls as Lauren fought to free herself, but the weight of her attackers was too much. The last thing she saw before she blacked out was the face of the mannequin from her apartment, its painted eyes staring down at her from the rafters. When she woke up, she was strapped to a table, her arms and legs bound with thick chains. The room was cold and sterile, the air heavy with the smell of bleach and decay. Junior's mask stared back at her, worn by a figure standing over her with a scalpel in hand. "You didn't listen, detective," the figure said, its voice low and menacing. "But don't worry. We'll make you one of us soon enough." The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the room as the figure dragged the scalpel across her skin, leaving a thin trail of blood. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the terror she felt knowing this was only the beginning. The room echoed with the clinking of chains as Lauren struggled against her restraints, her wrists burning from the raw metal digging into her flesh. The figure looming over her moved methodically, his every action calculated, every tool laid out as if this were some grotesque art. The scalpel in his gloved hand glinted under the flickering, and his mask, the twisted visage of Junior, seemed to grin wider the longer he stood over her. "You've been such a thorn in our side, detective," he said, his voice distorted by the voice modulator hidden beneath the mask. "But I'll admit, your resilience is inspiring. Let's see how long it lasts." He pressed the scalpel against her shoulder, dragging it slowly downward. The blade bit into her skin, parting flesh with excruciating precision. Lauren gritted her teeth, a strangled cry escaping her lips as warm blood pooled and dripped onto the metal table beneath her. The figure tilted his head, studying her reaction like a scientist observing an experiment. He dug deeper, twisting the blade slightly as it traveled down her arm, the searing pain sending shockwaves through her body. "Do you know what I love most about this city?" he mused, his tone almost conversational as he set the scalpel aside and picked up a pair of pliers. "The sound of it screaming." He leaned over her, his mask inches from her face. The smell of his sweat and the faint scent of gasoline invaded her senses. Without warning, he clamped the pliers around the nail of her right index finger. Lauren's eyes widened as she realized what was coming, and she thrashed against the chains, her breath hitching in panic. "Let's hear it, detective. Scream for me." He yanked hard, tearing the nail from her finger with a sickening wet snap. The pain was white-hot, a firestorm of agony that surged through her hand and up her arm. Lauren screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the room, mingling with the soft chuckle of her tormentor. Blood spurted from the exposed nail bed, dripping down her hand and pooling on the floor. "That's it," he purred. "Music to my ears." Before she could recover, he moved to the next finger, the pliers snapping shut with practiced ease. Another yank, another nail ripped free, another scream torn down her face as the pain blurred the edges of her vision. She tried to focus, to push through the haze of agony, but her body was betraying her, the shock setting in and weakening her resolve. Her tormentor set the pliers down and turned to a small, portable blowtorch resting on the table. He ignited it with a flick of his wrist, the blue flame dancing hungrily in the dim light. The heat radiated across her skin as he brought the torch closer, holding it just inches from her exposed flesh. "You've got fire in you, detective. Let's see how well you handle it." He pressed the flame against her forearm, the searing heat sizzling her skin and filling the room with the nauseating stench of burning flesh. Lauren writhed in her restraints, her screams hoarse and broken as the flame ate away at her arm. The pain was unbearable, a living, breathing thing that consumed her entirely. "Don't pass out now," he warned, tapping her cheek lightly with his gloved hand. The fun's just getting started. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere behind him, and he turned to face the new arrivals. 2 more masked figures entered the room, dragging a bound and gagged man between them. His face was bruised and swollen, his eyes wide with terror as he took in the horrific scene before him. "We brought you a friend, detective," the lead figure said, gesturing to the man. "Someone who knows exactly how this nightmare started." Lauren's heart sank as she recognized him. It was Eddie Harper, one of the officers who had worked on Junior's original case. He had been the one to apprehend Junior, the one who had beaten him within an inch of his life during the arrest. The masked figure turned to Eddie, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've got a lot of sins to atone for, Officer Harper. Let's start with those hands of yours." 2 other figures forced Eddie to his knees and held him in place as the leader picked up a sledgehammer. Eddie's muffled screams grew louder as the hammer was raised high above his head. The sound of bone shattering echoed through the room as the hammer came crashing down on Eddie's right hand, reducing it to a mangled mess of blood and shattered bone. Eddie's screams turned to choking sobs as the hammer was lifted again, this time aimed at his left hand. Another sickening crunch, another spray of blood, and Eddie's hands were left useless, his fingers twisted at unnatural angles. Lauren watched in horror, her own pain momentarily forgotten as she locked eyes with Eddie. She wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but her voice was gone, her body too weak to fight. The leader turned back to her, his mask tilting slightly as if he were smiling beneath it. "Do you see, detective? This city is mine now. And you? You're just the opening act." He lifted the blowtorch again, aiming it at her face this time. The heat was unbearable as it inched closer, her skin prickling with the promise of more pain. And then, the lights went out. In the sudden darkness, the room was filled with chaos. Shouts, the sound of metal clashing against metal, and the unmistakable roar of gunfire echoed around her. Backup had finally arrived, but it was too late for Eddie, too late for the nightmare that had already begun to consume the city. Woke in a hospital bed, the sterile white walls a stark contrast to the blood-drenched horrors she had endured. Her hands were bandaged, her arm wrapped in gauze where the blowtorch had seared her flesh. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but the worst agony was in her mind. The images of Eddie's shattered hands and the masked tormentor's laughter played on a loop, a haunting reminder of her failure. The hospital room wasn't safe. She knew that. The city wasn't safe. Junior's disciples were out there, and she was their primary target. Her colleagues had assured her that security was tight, but the sinking feeling in her gut told her otherwise. Her instincts had been sharpened by years of hunting monsters. And now those same instincts were screaming at her to run. That night, as the hospital halls fell silent, she heard it, the faint sound of heavy boots on linoleum. She reached for the call button, but before her fingers could press it, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city beyond the window. The door creaked open slowly, and Lauren froze. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light. The unmistakable shape of Junior's mask stared at her, its hollow eyes promising more pain. She fumbled for the stand beside her bed, gripping it tightly as the figure stepped closer. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The distorted voice echoed in the small room. Lauren swung the stand with all her strength, catching the figure across the side of the head. The mask cracked slightly, but he barely flinched. He grabbed the stand and yanked it from her grip, tossing it aside. She scrambled off the bed, ignoring the searing pain in her body as she lunged for the door. She didn't make it far. Another figure appeared in the hallway, this one holding a long, rusted machete. Lauren backed away, her breathing ragged as the 2 masked figures closed in on her. "Let's take this somewhere more intimate," the first one said, pulling a syringe from his pocket. Lauren fought as the needle plunged into her neck, her vision swimming as the sedative took hold. When she awoke, she was strapped to a chair in what appeared to be an old subway tunnel. The walls were damp and covered in graffiti, the air thick with the stench of mildew and decay. Chains hung from the ceiling, their metal clinking softly in the cold draft. She wasn't alone, a row of people lined the wall, each bound and gagged, their eyes wide with terror. Some were unconscious, their heads lolling to the side, while others sobbed quietly, their muffled cries echoing in the cavernous space. In the center of the room stood a table covered in bloodied tools, saws, knives, pliers, and other instruments of torment. The leader stood before her, his mask now cracked and revealing part of his face, a twisted grin etched with scars. He held a jagged knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the dim light. "Welcome to the show, detective. Tonight, you get a front row seat to the nightmare." He turned to the first victim, a young woman with a tear-streaked face. Without hesitation, he plunged the knife into her shoulder, twisting it as she screamed against her gag. Blood poured from the wound, staining her shirt and pooling on the floor. He moved methodically, carving into her flesh with precision, her muffled cries blending with the sounds of slicing meat. Lauren thrashed against her restraints, screaming for him to stop, but the other disciples only laughed. One of them stepped forward, a hulking figure with a chainsaw slung over his shoulder. He revved it to life, the deafening roar filling the tunnel as he approached the next victim, a middle-aged man who had already wet himself in terror. The chainsaw bit into the man's leg, the teeth tearing through flesh and bone with horrifying sprayed across the walls as the man's screams grew weaker, his body convulsing violently before going limp. The disciples cheered, their voices echoing like a demonic choir. "Do you see, detective?" the leader said, turning back to her. "This is what you couldn't stop. This is the chaos you've unleashed." He approached her, the bloodied knife still in his hand. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look into his eyes. "But you're not just a spectator tonight. You're part of the performance." He pressed the knife against her cheek, the blade drawing a thin line of blood as he traced it slowly down to her neck. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a scream, biting down hard on her lip to stifle the pain. The leader stepped back, addressing the other disciples. "Prepare her. Let's see how much a hero can endure." Two of them stepped forward, unstrapping her from the chair and dragging her to the center of the room. They tied her hands above her head, the chains digging into her wrists as they hoisted her off the ground. She dangled there, her feet barely touching the floor, as the leader selected a long, serrated blade from the table. He approached her slowly, savoring the moment. "You'll scream, detective. They always do." The blade bit into her side, the jagged edge tearing through her skin with agonizing slowness. Blood dripped down her body, pooling beneath her as the pain became unbearable. She clenched her jaw, refusing to scream, even as he carved deeper, his laughter echoing around her. "You're stronger than most," he said, wiping the blade on his sleeve. "But everyone breaks eventually." Lauren's vision blurred, the pain threatening to drag her into unconsciousness. But she couldn't give up. Not now.
Stood amidst the carnage, her chest heaving, the rusted pipe slick with blood in her trembling hands. The underground chamber stank of death, the cries of the dead and dying echoing faintly in her ears. The disciples lay scattered around her, their grotesque masks shattered, their bodies twisted and broken. But the fight wasn't over. She could feel it in the air, the oppressive weight of Junior's presence, like a predator stalking its prey. A slow, mocking clap rang out from the shadows, and her blood ran cold. Junior stepped into the dim light, his cracked mask glinting like a grinning skull. He dragged a massive cleaver behind him, the blade scraping against the concrete with a sound that set her teeth on edge. "You've made quite a mess, detective," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "But I expected nothing less from you. That fire in your eyes, it's what makes breaking you so much more satisfying." Lauren tightened her grip on the pipe, her knuckles white. "You're done, Junior. Your sick little cult is finished." Junior laughed, the sound echoing like the rattling of bones. "You think this ends with me? The nightmare doesn't die, Lauren. It just changes shape." He lunged at her with shocking speed, the cleaver slicing through the air. Lauren dodged, barely avoiding the deadly blade. She swung the pipe with all her strength, but Junior caught it mid-swing, wrenching it from her hands and tossing it aside like a toy. He struck her across the face with the back of his hand, sending her sprawling to the ground. Lauren's vision blurred as she struggled to her feet, blood dripping from her split lip. Junior loomed over her, his cleaver raised high. In that moment, she knew she couldn't overpower him. Not directly. But she wasn't out of options. Her eyes darted to the table of tools nearby. She reached for the closest weapon she could find, a jagged shard of glass, and clutched it tightly, ignoring the way it bit into her palm. Junior brought the cleaver down. She rolled to the side, the blade striking the floor with a deafening clang. Using the momentary opening, Lauren drove the glass shard into his thigh, twisting it viciously. Junior howled in pain, staggering back. She didn't stop. She grabbed a nearby hammer and swung it at his knee, shattering the joint with a sickening crunch. He collapsed to the ground, the cleaver clattering from his hand. Lauren stood over him, the hammer raised, her breathing ragged. Junior laughed through gritted teeth, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "Do it," he taunted. "Be the monster. You've already got the taste for it." For a moment, she hesitated. Killing him would make her no better than the monster he was. But then she thought of Eddie, of the countless lives he had destroyed, and of the blood-soaked city that still trembled under his reign of terror. No, this wasn't about becoming a monster. This was justice. She brought the hammer down with a roar, again and again, until his laughter turned to silence and his mask was nothing more than a shattered relic. Blood spattered across her face, her hands, the floor, but she didn't stop until she was sure he would never rise again. When it was over, she stumbled back, her legs barely holding her. The chamber was silent now, save for the distant hum of the city above. She freed the remaining captives, their tear-streaked faces a painful reminder of what they had all endured. Together, they limped out of the nightmare, into the light of a new dawn. The police arrived soon after, swarming the scene. Lauren gave her statement in a detached monotone, the reality of what she had done sinking in with every word. Junior was dead. The cult was dismantled. But the scars he had left, on her, on the city, would never fully heal. Weeks later, as she sat alone in her apartment, the weight of everything finally hit her. She stared at the news report on her television, line declaring the end of New York's nightmare. They called her a hero. But she didn't feel like one. The blood on her hands was a reminder that the line between hero and monster was thinner than she had ever imagined. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard faint laughter in the distance. A shadow passed over her window, and for a moment, her heart stopped. But when she looked outside, the street was empty, the nightmare was over. But deep down, she knew it would never truly be gone. Monsters like Junior didn't just disappear. They left pieces of themselves behind, buried in the cracks of the city, waiting to rise again. And when they did, she would be ready.